Book 1, Chapter 1, Prologue. Our chapter begins through the POV of a random man named Will. The setting is beyond the wall in the haunted forest. Currently, the men are tracking a band of wildling raiders, a mission given to them by Commander Mormont. I'm going to refer to the map here so you guys can see exactly where the haunted forest is in correlation to the wall and the Night's Watch and all that. One thing to note about every prologue chapter in each book that's pretty interesting is that George R. R. Martin legit just puts you in the most random of scenarios with absolutely zero context, and it's a bit of a game to figure out the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Upon reading further, we find out the story begins with three men, each a member of the Night's Watch. We are learning through the perspective of Will. But there's also Sir Waymar Royce, who's described as a handsome, young, 18 years old, gray eyed, graceful, and slender as a knife. We also learn that he's only been a brother of the Night's Watch for 6 months. There's also Garrett, who's a veteran of the Night's Watch, as he's an old man past 50, and he's missing both ears, three toes, and his left pinky finger. Poor Garrett. And then there's Will, who and Will has been on the wall for 4 years. And essentially, the story begins with the men arguing because Will claims to have seen that the wildling rangers that they've been chasing, and he tells the other men that they're all dead, having died from hypothermia, aka the poor sons of bitches froze to death. But that gets Sir Royce. I'm just gonna call him Sir Royce. I'm not gonna say his full name, Sir Royce. That gets him thinking and presses Will for more information, like if there was any blood or if he confirmed in any way whether or not they really are dead. Will just argues back and claims that the men he saw in the camp he saw that they stood still and laid still and sat or whatever more still than any living man possibly could, and that was all the proof he needed. And then Sir Royce begins to argue back and just continues to ask him for more information. And then we're able to deduce that Sir Royce is kind of a smart guy for his age, despite being like the youngest of the three men here. Um, as he comes to the conclusion that it's impossible for those men to have frozen to death due to the fact that the wall is currently weeping, right? And that might sound a little confusing at first, but let's just think about it, really break it down. The wall is a solid block of ice. Huge, right? Huge wall. And at the wall, if the giant ice wall that the Night's Watch is responsible for is quite literally weeping, that means what? That it's not frozen solid, that it's not cold enough to keep it from melting ever so slightly, right? It's not melting to the point of there's going to be a pool or anything, but it is melting to the point that the wall appears to be weeping. So that tells us that the wall isn't frozen solid and that it's not cold enough for the weather to kill eight grown men, as the book quotes, in clad fur and leather, with shelter nearby and the ability to start a fire. So Sir Royce comes to this conclusion and tells both men it's impossible for them to have died of hyperthermia. So he wants to investigate it further. So he gives so Sir Royce gives both Will and Garrett instructions for the three of them to go where they had last seen the bodies. Upon getting closer to the spot, Garrett claims that something's wrong. There's something in the air, something ain't right, something's amiss, and it's just a strange feeling. And Will agrees and says that he has the same irregular feeling as Garrett, and their captain just gives them a direct order to just man up. He will not entertain such folly, and the captain gives Garrett actually a direct order telling him to stay in place with their horses and their equipment as he and Will continue to investigate. Garrett then asks if he can build a fire, claiming that there's enemies a fire will keep away. And that's just great foreshadowing right there. You know, that's just wonderful foreshadowing by George R. R. Martin doing a great job. But Sir Royce insisted no fire, claiming that it'll give away their location. And Will and Sir Royce go ahead and continue alone by themselves. Upon continuing, they make it all the way to the camp, and Will begins to freak out because the men he had previously claimed to be dead are all missing. And that's when Royce begins to tease Will and tells him, and I quote, "Your dead men seem to have moved away." Will can't really acknowledge it, and he's just mind blown and kind of in shock. He can't really even speak. And Royce then gives him instructions to basically that they're gonna find these men by any means possible because he's not gonna return to Castle Black a failure on his very first ranging. And in my opinion, this is very foolish because, like, you already know there's possibly 8 men, and they're a small army of 3, outnumbered nearly fucking more than double, and he's insistent upon continuing this investigation. So afterwards, Royce then gives Will an order to climb a tree and look for signs of a fire so that they can track down the men that were previously there. When Will begins to climb the tree, he's making a good bit of progress up the tree, and then he suddenly hears Royce beginning to call out to someone. So he stops what he's doing and he looks, listens, and just keeps a general eye out. Sir Royce received no response for him calling if anyone's there or anything like that. But what does happen as a somewhat of a response, I guess you could say, is the temperature around them drops significantly. And both men both take note of how it is freezing, where moments ago, neither one of them were complaining about that. So it just gets pretty interesting as to what's causing it to freeze. That's when a shadow emerges in front of Sir Royce. And from the book, it's quote, "Tall it was and gaunt, and hard as bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. One moment white as fresh snow, and the next as black as a shadow." Will immediately basically comes to the conclusion that this is an other, and this is where it also will differentiate from the show because they call White Walkers others. They're basically the same thing. I don't know. I can't recall whether or not they even ever say the term or whatever White Walker. Maybe I'm tripping, but they mainly refer to them as the others, and uh, that's what Will calls them. Sir Royce then warns the other to not come closer, but when he does give him that warning, Will makes note that his voice cracks. And he is the youngest of the 3 men, so it's not like that's the craziest thing. It said that he was 18, and he's still he's just petrified of the fact that he's face to face with another, aka a White Walker. And then that's when the other that is facing him pulls out his weapon. It's a long sword that's made of a material that Will has never seen before, and he claims that there's no way the sword was man-made or has any man-made metals in it. And he describes the blade as alive with moonlight, translucent shards of crystal so thin that it seemed to almost vanish. And then that it also had a faint blue shimmer to it. And then that's when Sir Royce and the other began to duel. And this is also where it is different from the show because they actually do fight for a bit. The sword of Royce doesn't just break and shatter right away. Spoiler. But upon them engaging in their little fight in combat, uh, Will sees the eyes of the other and makes a note saying that they're a deep blue that burned like ice. The man and the monster continue their fight, crossing swords multiple times, but there was no ringing or typical clash of metal on metal. But instead, when the swords met, there was a high pitched noise that sounded like an animal screaming in pain, noted by Will. As the battle continues, Will claims more others begin to show up, but not at all directly intervening in their fight at all. They surround the two fighters, simply just watching. Will claims they all look exactly the same. They even says that they could be twins essentially because they look so alike. From the one other that's actually fighting Sir Royce to the three, four, five that surround them and begin to watch. It's not the complete eight of the men and women that they were looking for, but it is almost the full amount, honestly. But I believe it's like five. They all have the exact same blue eyes of that burning with ice. But shortly after making this note of a description of all the rest of the others that pull up, Sir Royce gets wounded with a significant strike. And upon landing this blow, Will claims that the other that was fighting Sir Royce actually says something. And this is also where it obviously is very different from the show, and it's honestly super cool part of the books and the lore is that like the White Walkers, quote unquote, right? The others um are really like kind of viewed as like almost having their own society and their own like hierarchy and their own language, like Will's saying here, and like that they communicate and shit amongst themselves as opposed to just being like mindless beings. And there's a whole lot of extra lore that comes with the others that's honestly super fascinating. And we'll get to it for sure, but this is just the intro. So Sir Royce then lets out a final war cry, trying to hype himself up, and he screams for Robert, and that's call to the actual king, Robert Baratheon. He's on the Iron Throne as of the prologue of Book One, and he charges. But this time, when their swords meet, Sir Royce's sword completely shatters into. It was in this moment all who were previously surrounding them and spectating this fight just pounced on Sir Royce as if the shattering of the sword was a signal to attack. Will calls it cold butchery, but shortly after he just closes his eyes and just Honestly, probably disassociates for the next few minutes. Because he's just in this tree. Still, he's still up this tree. He hasn't climbed down. I think it said he climbed to like a branch or something like that. So he's not just carrying his own weight. He might be, but um, what's it called? He's up in this tree still, and he essentially just waits until the White Walkers and the others leave, and he can climb down because they haven't seen him yet. So he's just kind of waiting up there, and the book says a long time passes before Will deemed it safe to finally climb down. But once he does climb down, he tries to make sense of what just happened, and he comes to the conclusion that he needs to report what happened to Sir Royce, and he needs to also have evidence of that. And he reaches for shards of the broken sword, deciding that that will be his evidence. And honestly, that would be substantial because, especially at this time, imagine like a straight metal sword being shattered in 1,000 pieces. Like the Night's watching them will recognize one of their swords. They deal with one like every day, so that'd be insane for it to be in that many pieces. But unfortunately, that's when Sir Royce stands over him, rising from the dead, and he wraps both of his hands around Will's throat and begins to squeeze. And that is how the prologue ends, and it is also the end of 4.